Human trafficking in the North Country and some of the advocacy work that they're doing and ways that the rest of us can get involved in this. And human trafficking is, I was reading something just the other day that Jimmy Carter had written about human trafficking, that there are actually more people in slavery now than there were back during the 18th and 19th centuries, when we think of when slavery was rampant and there were no laws against it. Well, now there are just physically more people in slavery right now than there were back then, and there are laws against it. So without further ado, David and Sibel.
Well, thank you. Good evening. Thank you for having us. My name is Sibel, and it really is an honor to be here, and we've been kind of raising this awareness for a while. Thank you for coming out. It's not an easy topic to talk about, but I'd just like to first start by just telling why I got involved and how this is sort of on my heart, or it has been developed. Back in 2009, I went to a social well, let me back up a little bit. I was born in a Thai refugee camp. My family fled from the Khmer Rouge, the killing fields. If you ever watched the movie, about 1.7 million people died out of a population of 7 million. So my parents survived through all that. I was born in that refugee camp as they were fleeing. And so I went back to Cambodia back in 2003 or so, and I really was able to kind of see a lot of the kids on the streets and everything. So that really kind of opened my eyes to say, that could have been me. And so back in 2009, 2010, 2009, at a social conference I went to, I was shown a video, and I'll show you a video clip today of what I saw about Cambodian kids who have been trafficked as young, really, really young, ages 8, 9, and 10. And I'm thinking to myself, that could be my family, that could be me. So I was shocked, I was appalled. I said, this stuff cannot happen nowadays. So since 2010, I've been told through a mutual friend that Dave Bug over at SUNY Potsdam is kind of doing some studies on this. So I called up Dave. I said, hey Dave, how's it going? And so Dave and I started a discussion panel. Yep, I'm going to show you a video that kind of gives you a snapshot of what trafficking is about. It's a little graphic, so please, if just be aware, be warned. Yeah, this video is very moving and is shocking. I've seen it a few times. That's just a good snapshot of what types of trafficking it is. Let's go and define trafficking. Trafficking is different from smuggling. Okay, trafficking is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring through by means of, this is key, threat, force, or other forms of coercion. Okay, so smuggling is when you're paying somebody to smuggle you from one country to another. Okay, and then after you get to that country, you're free to go wherever you want and do what you want. That's the smuggling. That's different. Trafficking is you're being forced to go somewhere or do something that is against your will. And here's an example. For example, somebody from a country that lacks jobs, mom, dad, brothers and sisters in the hospital, and they respond to an advertisement to be a house sitter in Italy or in Rome or in Japan. So what happens is this person will apply for this job, submit all their documents because this company looks very legitimate. They hop on the plane. All of a sudden, the plane is not going exactly where they want it to go, or they'll go to the destination, have their visas, passports taken from them, and then they've been trafficked through a legitimate organization. Another example is if an ad for it to be a model and a model agency. So they'll go and provide all their information for their families, their children, their family members are all in a database. So what happens, the trafficker will say, you come and you work for me at this strip club and you're doing these things. We have access to we know where your family is. And that's an illicit coercive threat. Just the threat of saying, I have all your information. And they do. So that is another form of coercion. So that's a big difference between trafficking of human trafficking versus smuggling. I just wanted to make sure there's that difference that we know. So let's continue on. And again, really the important part was the abduction, force, fraud, or deception, and abuse of power and position over their vulnerability. So you can read through that definition. It really is just one individual having power over another individual, and that's the form of trafficking. And then that's really what happens is that, yeah, it's for one group of people to have authority over another group of people through these things. So that's really the definition of trafficking. And there are two types of trafficking. And really is, the next slide is, basically there are two types. There are different types of trafficking. One is like prostitution. You can be trafficked into sexual services. Working in massage parlors, working in go-go bars, karaoke bars. There are, and then not only just working in them, then you're forced to do other things in prostitution. That's part of it. That's, again, there is examples of not just sexual, prostitution, sexual trafficking. That gets a lot of media attention. There are other types of trafficking, like labor trafficking. And in labor trafficking, actually we have some friends we know that are from Eritrea. And in the news, Eritrea is a small country in East Africa. And in the desert, people have been being trafficked for their organs. This type of labor trafficking, there are three types: bonded labor, forced labor, and child labor. Bonded labor, as you see these two kids holding up bricks, it's a big problem in India, where they, what happens is a family falls in hard times. Say they have a funeral, somebody is getting married, they need to borrow money. So they borrow the equivalent of $50 US, and what happens is many of these people are illiterate. They cannot calculate. So what they do is they sign some piece of paper saying that I borrowed some money. And what happens is they add so much interest that they set it up in a way that they'll never ever pay back that $50. And 2 or 3 generations of families have been in debt for $50 working these kilns, making bricks, because they don't know how to add, they don't know the math, they don't know what they're being conned into. They're charging so much interest that is ridiculous. So a $50 loan will end up being $3,000 in 2 years. It'll be the setup where they'll never be able to pay it back. That's bonded labor. Forced labor, again, there's examples of Thailand where fishermen or Thai men will go out into the docks looking for work, bring fish from the ships to the market. What they do is they are forced to work on the shipping industry. At gunpoint, they're told to get on the ships, and they won't be able to see land 3 months later. And if they die, they just throw them off. So they're forced into these examples. That's for eating seafood, you have to ask, where did the seafood come from? So that's just something that we'll talk about a little bit later. But we don't know where our food supply comes from. If we don't know, it could be from someone who's been forced to work the shipping industries or the fishing and the shrimp industries. Child labor. Who here has a smartphone or an iPhone or something? An Apple product, okay? Apple has been in the news a lot lately for using child labor to mine some of these minerals, these precious minerals to put into your smartphones, this TV here, and much of our electronics. And they've been actually doing better in cleaning up their supply chain. But child labor, if anyone likes coffee or chocolate, that a lot of those pictures, those images of a lot of people being cut in the back, or as you see in the video before, that's a result of the chocolate the coffee and the chocolate plantation. Slaves or forced labor, child labor had to work these fields. If they ran away or did something bad, they would somehow be scarred, and that's why you see a lot of the people, mining, the kids mining in Africa, these minerals that we'll use to make our electronics. So the only way consumers need to know where they're put some pressure on the companies to clean up their supply chains, to make sure they're not using child labor, because knowingly or unknowingly, we might be helping this particular industry whenever we buy a new iPhone. we not know it. So that's one example there. All right. How do you know it's trafficking? Sometimes we don't really know. So I think UNO DC, this organization, created sort of a little formula of what it can, what it means to kind of give you an idea of what is this trafficking or not trafficking. So, ACT, there's the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, the receipt of persons. ACT, the means. The means is very important. The threat or use of force, we talked about that before. Coercion, abduction, fraud, deception. Fraud and deception are very, very big keys. If you're deceived, if you really think you're getting a job in Italy as a waitress, making promise that $300 a day, a month, and you're living off of $30 a month, you really can get caught up because you need this job. You need to help your parents who might be in the hospital. You need this. So there's a lot of fraud going on, and you're applying to what looks like a legitimate organization. You're going through an application process that you think is legitimate. So the abuse of power and vulnerability, giving payments or benefits. Those are the means. Sometimes the traffic victims actually have to pay a lot of money up front, an application fee. So they really think this is an internship. They really think it's a job elsewhere. The purpose. This, again, is really important. Exploitation, including prostitution, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, removal of organs, we talked about that, and also other types of exploitation. So somebody's being exploited for whatever it is. For sex, for labor, something is being exploited. So if there are elements of these three categories, most likely it is trafficking.
Isabel said, do you want to do a human trafficking presentation with me? I said, well, what do I know about human trafficking? Even though I'm a criminologist, 4 years ago I'd started a book about drug trafficking. And so I was like, yeah, I could use your help. And I started thinking about this drug trafficking book that I'd started to write. And I started realizing I knew a lot more about human trafficking than I'd realized. And part of that came through an interview I'd done with a guy for this book. He used to be a member of a little organized crime group you might have heard of called the Gambino crime family, right? And so he'd started out trafficking firearms, and that had turned into trafficking cocaine. He had made connections between the Gambinos and the Colombian cartel. And I had asked him at one point, how do you move a metric ton of cocaine from Colombia to New York City? And so he explained the process. And then just as an aside, it was a really casual thing for him. He just said you'd move people the same way. And what I started to realize is that as I've been doing research for this book, I had been getting lots of comments like that from law enforcement officers that I had spoken to, from other people who were involved in criminal enterprises. And I started realizing, like I said, I knew a lot more about human trafficking than I originally had thought. No, I still haven't finished the book. I need to go on sabbatical. So anyway, so my sort of interest in criminology is towards comparative and international sort of crime. So I'm going to talk about a little bit how the bigger scale of things gets sort of down to our neck of the woods. So one of the first things to really sort of understand, because a lot of people always ask Sabella and I, like, how can people do this, is to understand two very sort of basic things. One is quite often we're dealing with a problem of culture, whether it's a problem of sort of how people view children, because even in the United States, the idea of children as we have them today is relatively an invention of only the last 100 years or so. We didn't have the term teenager in the way we understand it today until sort of post-Depression. I didn't even know teenagers were a thing until a few years ago. Now I've got to deal with Justin Bieber. We didn't have those things. And so in some parts of the world, at the age of 7, your child's no longer a child, they're a commodity. In some cultures, it can be as young as 3. Children going out to work in the fields, or with animals, or whatever it is that the culture might require. So we might find people selling their children or selling themselves because of how they value people or how they don't value people from our own standards. But it also could be how the traffickers are exploiting culture. As some of Sibel's examples have said, people are looking for jobs, people are looking for work, they're looking for opportunities. And so people exploit that. You know, we exploit people's desperation, we exploit their insecurities. You know, we do those things, and we know what that culture is, and so if you know how to manipulate it, you can get people to do things. We see this in Eastern Europe, especially in Russia, with traffickers tackling women that in Russia are sort of used to some sort of arranged marriage situation. It's not quite as romantic sometimes for women in Russia for their relationships. And so these dating broker services that appear in Russia, those can be exploited. If women know that they might need those things to perhaps meet a suitable husband or something like that, that culture then can be exploited. Right? So this is what we talk about when we say a problem of culture. So how do we value people? The other thing too is historical amnesia. When I was in graduate school, I was doing some research on a sociologist by the name of Frances Keller. She was a female sociologist out of the University of Chicago. And she wrote a book in the early 1900s about the conditions of women's labor in the United States. And so I read that book. And as I started doing this presentations with Sibel, I started thinking about this book a lot. And I started realizing that what Keller was describing was happening to some of the women in the United States in the early 1900s was what we would call today human trafficking. Women in farms and rural areas, as we industrialize cities like Chicago and New York, were answering ads to come to the city for work, whether it was in a factory or to be a maid or a nanny or something to that effect. And they would make that long journey and they would find themselves in this new city, and then they would find themselves being forced into prostitution in a brothel in the United States as little as 100 years ago. Frances Keller's work has pretty much been lost by my discipline. Most sociologists don't read her. I read her by accident. I did it for a homework assignment. Most sociologists don't even know who I'm talking about when I say Frances Keller. And so we forget these things. We forget that just 100 years ago, we had human trafficking in the United States. We just didn't call it that then. We didn't look at it that way. Next one. Right? So, look at international human trafficking. One of the things that especially we've seen in the last 4 years as we've been making these presentations is a lot of new law. And so I've got an example of some law here in the U.S., the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000, some of the legalese there. And it's been good. When I first started making these presentations, I started complaining about how little training law enforcement were getting. That's a personal thing for me because before I became a professor at SUNY Potsdam, I was a law enforcement trainer in Texas with the state down there. And I saw all the things we were training officers on, and I knew we weren't training officers on human trafficking. In California, organized crime started stealing avocados because we were paying $5 for a piece of fruit so we could put guacamole on hamburgers. And so they moved into the market. And so we're just doing the same thing now with people, right? There's an opportunity there and they exploit it. So the EU experienced, because of what happened in Germany, they put these laws into place. And so the traffickers just followed the law. They got the visas, they got the permits, and now they've got legally more control over their victims. Because when law enforcement come into contact with the victims now, the papers check out, there's no crime, and they have to walk away. They maintain that control through coercion by threatening these women, by threatening their families back home. if you tell law enforcement that you are really here against your will, even though you've got legal papers, you'll get deported anyway, and then we'll retaliate against your family. For as little as $2,000, we could offer protection to those women and their families, but nobody's given out $2,000 to do that. And when you think about it, I mean, yeah, $2,000 can be a lot of money. I remember in graduate school when $2,000 was a lot of money. I remember today when it's a lot of money. My car cost $2,000, right? But, you know, $2,000 can offer a lot of protection to victims. And so organized crime in the EU, they're exploiting it. We passed a law and it didn't stop them. It just gave them a new way of exerting control. So we have to, you know, stay on top of this sort of stuff. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the rest of the world. So we have this map, and it shows us here the USA being a destination country for victims of trafficking, and this is more just to give you sort of a visual as I talk about some other examples. All these arrows are coming to the US, and you can see a variety of these destinations, and they're actually probably missing a few. There should be a lot more going to Nevada. Las Vegas, Nevada is the #1 destination for human trafficking in the United States. While various counties in Nevada have legalized prostitution, for example, Clark County, the city of Las Vegas, prostitution is not legal. So Las Vegas becomes, again, a big destination city, because people think that prostitution is legal in Las Vegas, and so then they expect it, and there's that demand, and organized crime steps in and fills that supply. What this map leaves out is that there should be arrows going in a lot more directions. For example, we should have arrows going from Colombia in South America all the way to Japan. And you might be wondering, why are we sending Colombian women to Japan of all places? So Sibel kept referring to that I'd talk about pornography. So this is where I get to talk about pornography. So in Japan, there are some pretty strict censorship laws about pornography. All the things that people watch pornography for in the United States are blurred out in Japan. They're little pixelated boxes, right, over all the genitalia, right? Which means that in Japan, there's a huge demand for uncensored pornography. Where do they get it? Well, they get it from the West. Organized crime groups like the Yakuza basically call up the United States and order it, where it's legal to produce, and they buy legal American pornography, have it shipped to Japan, where they distribute it illegally on the black market. What this has done is it's then now given Japanese men a taste for what American men want. And so Hispanic and Latino women became a sexual commodity in pornography a few years ago. And so that pornography got shipped to Japan, and so Japanese men wanted Latino and Hispanic women to have sex with. And I don't know if you know anything about Japan, but there's not any Hispanic or Latino women in Japan, right? So they had to import them. And so they called up organized crime groups, MS-13, groups in Colombia, and basically started having women imported to meet that demand. Legal American pornography created an illegal demand for women in Japan. So these arrows should be going a lot of different directions. Hit that next one. Thanks. So, other ways demand is created. Japan also, besides having this demand for women, is also one of the #1 production companies for production countries for child pornography. So we have a lot of children being trafficked into Japan for the production of child porn. So that's a big problem. The country of Greece, for example, is the reason that we have Taken, which really got everybody jazzed up about this topic. So in Taken, Liam Neeson's saving his daughter right from those terrible Albanians that kidnapped her, right? Those Albanian sort of traffickers that movie is based around are actually a real phenomenon that stems back to at least 2005 when I first heard about it. Basically, the Albanian people throughout Europe find themselves terribly discriminated against and in many sort of disadvantaged social and economic sort of situations. And so Albanian traffickers have been going to Albanian families and saying, you know, if you give us your child, we can send them off to another country in Europe somewhere where they can have a good life. We'll give you a little bit of money, you know, and you can then be assured that your child's going to go somewhere else and be raised in a lifestyle that you would find more fitting. And so they hand off their children hoping that they'll get this better life. And Albanians, these Albanian crime groups, were then bringing them into Greece. And a lot of these children went into the sex tourism trade in Greece. Now, what made Greece such a good destination country? Well, one's geography. The sort of northern part of Greece, there are all those mountains and things, and so it's really easy to get people through those mountains. It's very hard to police them, so you can get people through those mountains. You've got a little Mediterranean Sea thing going on with all those islands down at the bottom on the south end of Greece. Perfect for bringing people in by boat, right? So a very difficult sort of set of terrain for law enforcement to police. Now, you may also have heard that Greece was having some economic problems, right? So it's not that Greece doesn't want to police this problem. They've got no money to police this problem. They've got geographical issues that are going to require specialized law enforcement to deal with those mountain regions and that coastal region. They do not have the funds to do anything about it. And in an industry, as Sibel's pointed out, that is billions of dollars and dwarfs three of the largest companies that we have in the United States, they can certainly outmaneuver and sort of out-equip Greek law enforcement with very little problems. Right? Great Britain, which actually you may not notice, but I'm actually a British and American citizen. I'm bilingual. I speak English and American. Back home, my countrymen like fish. We like cod and haddock. I like to deep fry that. And because we want so much fish, so that we can have our fish and chips with malt vinegar and mushy peas, we need people to work those boats that Sibel sort of showed you. And so in recent years, we've had boats wash ashore with Chinese individuals who have been forced into that fishery market to meet those demands for fish in England and in Northern Europe. And basically, when they might even be caught by the Royal Navy or any other European naval force, the boats and the people are expendable, so they scuttle them. You know, they try to sink them. And if that boat goes down, what's the big deal? Because as that video that Sibel showed, if we can buy somebody for $300, one of the things that video leaves out is during the height of slavery in Europe and in the United States, not only did the slave cost $40,000, but most slave owners paid for insurance because they were such a valuable commodity that if they lost that slave, they had an insurance policy to replace them. When a person costs $300 and you can get another one, you don't need insurance. They're disposable. Right? So in Great Britain, we're seeing trafficking for that. In the United States, not only we've got situations like Las Vegas, but in Albany, we've got suspected sort of trafficking. We see ads for prostitutes from various sort of Asian countries, but when you look at those ads, the phone numbers are all the same. So they might be advertising for one woman, and she might be from Korea, and another woman, and she's from Japan, but they've all got the same phone number. And it may even say in the ad, she has a booking agent, because her English isn't that good, which is just code for you're calling the trafficker to make those arrangements. That's really what we're talking about. You know, so not only Albany, but we've got even farms in the area that are under surveillance and investigation potentially. in the North Country for these kinds of things. So it's right here. It's in our backyard. If you drive down 81 into Pennsylvania, there are all these big truck stops in Pennsylvania, and you'll see them with these massage parlors for truckers. You know, got a bad back from, you know, driving your load. Then get out of your truck, you know, and come see our exotic staff, you know, from whatever country they're advertising, right? So it's in our backyard, right? Very close to us. So, how do we deal with organized crime groups? Well, it's tough. They can pay to corrupt people. We've had cases of corruption in the United States around drug trafficking, so we can almost guarantee that we've got corruption dealing with the issue of human trafficking. We've got public fear to contend with, particularly in areas where traffickers may be involved in illegal business, such as in agriculture. There may be so much money coming from that employer to support grocery stores, banks, restaurants, apartments, any other local businesses, that even if people see it, they're not going to speak out against it. Because what are the ramifications if they do? Will that business owner take their business away from their business? Will that put their family out of work? You know, what are they going to do about that? How are they going to address those sorts of concerns? And it co-opts entire communities into silence when they see these things. You know. And then when we're talking about this network of criminal groups, like I said, they've got a lot of resources. If the Yakuza can pick up the phone and call South America and get women shipped across the world, right? They're using the same technologies that make our ability to travel easier to traffic. They're using the internet, communications technologies, all these sorts of things to make their jobs easier. And they're cooperating. The Yakuza doesn't have to leave Japan to make this happen. American law enforcement, in trying to deal with an international problem, cannot guarantee that their partners overseas are not corrupted. They can't trust law enforcement elsewhere. And that's a big problem for them, because then how are they supposed to investigate it? How are they supposed to bring people to justice if they can't trust their partners elsewhere? And so organized crime, their networks are already up and running and they're efficient. And ours, our legal ones, have a long way to go to get there. Next slide. So, responding to the problem, right? 'Cause we've been pretty doom and gloomy, right? So, try and make it a little bit more positive now. Well, one of the first things is educating ourselves about the problem. This is where Sibel and I come in. Passing along information so we can start to sort of help you understand what we're sort of up against. From there, we've got a variety of things that we can do. We can get into political action. We can write our elected officials. We can ask for new legislation. But like I said earlier, because we know that organized crime will adapt to whatever laws we put in place, we cannot rest on our laurels when new pieces of legislation are put into effect. We then have to watch, what do traffickers do in response? And then do we need to update those pieces of legislation to match them? So we have to keep on that issue as well. Charitable support, right, is important as well. There are lots of NGOs doing really good things. And there are other organizations as well. NOMI Network, which sometimes Sibel talks about. Do you have any NOMI Network stuff with
Yes.
it? Yeah. Up here? Okay. NOMI Network is providing women who have escaped from brothels with sewing machines, so that they don't have to return to those brothels, that they have a way to support themselves by making purses and clothing and things like that. One of my colleagues at SUNY Potsdam started a project in Cambodia called the Proteep Project to help girls go to school so that they don't have to get sent by their families into situations where they have to work and earn money. And the way they do that is by providing the family with things like a bag of rice and school supplies and bicycles. And so Maya Kalanpur, my colleague, she started this project, to help these young girls. And so we can support charities like Maya's. Economic development is going to be a big thing. If people are desperate around the world because there's not money to support their families, then we need to have sustainable economic development in these countries so that selling people isn't the way to make money and survive and raise a family. We have to find ways to make sure other people can live too. And then, because like you said at the beginning, it's a problem of culture, then we need to tackle those cultural problems. We need to educate folks about how their cultures perhaps are being used against them, or even how their cultures do not support trafficking, and remind them that your values do not support the things that are happening in your country.